Is this thing on?
Yesterday's price is not today's price.
All right, welcome back to the Run the Numbers podcast. I'm CJ Gustafson here with Andy Raskin, and our audience is primarily people who work in finance, strategy, or operations at fast-growing tech companies. And when I get asked for career advice, I often tell people that storytelling is perhaps the most indispensable skill for someone who deals with numbers, which may sound counterintuitive at first, but I think a lot of people pigeonhole themselves into just being a, quote, numbers person or an Excel person, and they forget that the numbers are really just meant to serve as characters within an overall narrative arc. So, Andy, I'm excited to have you on, and I got to thank you up front because you've actually helped me already in my career.
Well, great to be here and great to hear that. How so?
So I recently raised a Series C as a CFO at a vertical SaaS company that I work at. And when I was designing the pitch deck for it, I relied on the framework that you've used to convey overall company messages, not just a finance message, but the strategic narrative of the company. And so when you answered my cold email to come on, I was pumped because I'm a consumer and a tried and true user of your frameworks.
That's so great to hear. I think there's this idea that like the message is sort of like a marketing thing because it's, I don't know, has to do with words, I guess. I consistently hear from, well, of course, people at product and other areas, but also CFOs that this is just like a really core part of what they have to do. Obviously, in pitching the company, but also even in, budget conversation, pitch it, what are we going to spend money on? It just comes in just so many parts of the job. So I hear that from a lot, and it's good to get that kind of validation from you too.
I think maybe I didn't notice it at first, but I also rely on some of the components of the strategic narrative, which I'll get into when I do have those budgeting conversations with my peers, because a lot of times you're saying, hey, we're brokering resources here, and if I give you this, then that means collectively we can't do that, and this is the problem we're trying to solve. So it does help with communicating a lot of messages, not just the, hey, can you give me money?
Yeah, and I hear from folks, I mean, especially in the product side, which is kind of related to what you're saying, we have to build some features and we have to not build others. So how do we prioritize? And I often hear that this narrative becomes kind of the North Star for making those decisions, at a high level. Obviously, there's lots and lots of things to think about, but at a high level, to have that kind of filter is really helpful.
So, Andy, just to kick things off here, can you give us a definition of what a strategic narrative is?
Yeah, I'll give you the definition. Let me give you a little background first before I do, so hopefully it makes a little more sense. So when I was kind of coming up and I went to business school and, started out as a marketer, the way I was taught to pitch is what I call the arrogant doctor. So the structure of it is you have a problem, pain, we have the solution, some kind of treatment, and let me tell you why it's better than the other treatments. So the whole structure of the thing, I mean, it sounds kind of customer focused because starting with your problem, but it really winds up being real focused on, well, let me brag about why we're better than the other products. And this is the right way to pitch for a lot of things, with things we buy in our daily lives, that's how buyers make decisions. Like we're going to round up all the alternatives, create some kind of bestness score for each one, and we're going to pick the best one, right? But I found that especially when I was getting involved in like pitching B2B companies, my own, so I was a startup founder and also working as a marketer and others, that it was a little different. First of all, the products are so complex, these sprawling platforms with lots and lots of features. We're going to say, okay, our product is better in this way. Well, there's so many. Can the buyer really even evaluate that without, spending hours and hours with the product? So it gets very easy for these everyone to make sort of the same claims and hard for the buyer to suss out whose claims hold water. What I started to see was that the breakout companies, especially like in B2B SaaS, were doing this different thing. And what I'll say is they were kind of positioning themselves as a movement. Like instead of seeing themselves as selling software, they were seeing themselves as selling a movement. And you asked how I define strategic narrative. I define it as the story they're telling that kind of transforms the buying of a product into the joining of a movement. But that's my definition, at least the one I like right now.
I love how you use the word movement because it makes people feel like they're on this journey, and it's an active term to kind of feel like you're along for the ride, or you're participating in something bigger than just you have a problem, I have a solution.
Yeah, and I think it's especially, you talk about CFOs pitching, investors or whatever, that movement shift also, it's kind of catnip for investors because they can smell opportunity in the change.
It absolutely is. And when I've been fundraising in the past, another term that we've tried to cling to is category. Say that we're defining a category or the de facto standard for a category. Is that the same thing as a movement, or are those two different things?
I find when people talk about, hey, we're going to create a category, the thing they focus on is, well, what's the 3-word name of this category that is going to magically make us sound like something totally new and amazing, and everyone's going to get it, and all that. And with very, very few exceptions, it just doesn't work that way. What happens is, even if you look at all the category books, books like Play Bigger, which is a big book about how to start a category, they all talk about, well, what's a category? Oh, it's this story about a shift from an old way of being, an old mindset, to a new mindset. And I think when people talk about category, they really lose sight of that. And when I talk about the narrative instead, I'm really focused on, well, what is that story that is going to imbue this category name with meaning? I kind of see the category name almost like a logo. Like logo designers famously say logos are like kind of empty vessels that you fill up with meaning. So now, you look at the Nike logo and it has this tremendous amount of meaning. But when it first started, it was just a little design that had no meaning, or not much. I think it's the same way with category names. Some of the greatest category names, that, like, I wrote this post about Zuora a bunch of years ago, and he created this category about subscription economy. If you talk to the CEO, like Tien Tzuo, he's like, well, when we first came up with it, we thought, wow, that's really horrible. Like, it's going to make people think of like just magazines and stuff, like just cheap infomercials. But by telling that story about the shift from, hey, we used to buy software through transactions, or lots of things through transactions, and now we're buying through software, it takes on a meaning over time.
Zuora is an excellent example, and I remember that post. It went quite viral. I'll link to it in the show notes. Just before we jump into the components of the strategic narrative for people, do you mind giving an example of a company who has a strategic narrative to make it just a little bit more real?
Yeah, sure. Well, one I can talk about, this is a company that makes software for robotics developers. The company is called Foxglove. Foxglove.dev is their website. So let's say you're building like a fleet of autonomous, lawnmowers or, self-driving cars, and something goes wrong with one of them. Well, you're going to have to like get all this software off the robot. You may have to do like simulations locally to figure out what happened using all the sensor and image data. Have to deploy fixes. So anyway, Foxglove lets you do all that stuff. And the CEO, Adrian McNeil's, so they're a Series A company. They've raised something around 20 million. They have some traction, but he was telling me like, hey, we basically go and pitch, here's the data we let you get at, and here's how we organize it for you. And he said, what was happening was companies weren't really getting like the business value, especially senior execs weren't getting like, well, why do I need to capture all this data? And, it just wasn't coming through. So the narrative we built, it starts with this declaration that robots have graduated from the lab. And they summarize this as goodbye prototypes, hello production. And what this is about is we went to their customers and we said, hey, what is the big shift in your world that basically keeps you up at night, that is life and death stakes for you, that of course that our software helps you deal with? And This is what they told us. They said, hey, it used to be, even just a few years ago, for a robotics company, if you built a great prototype in the lab that worked, you were a successful company. That's no longer the case. Now these machines have to work at scale out in the field. And so you have this new challenge. So that's the kind of the centerpiece of the narratives, this shift from robotics prototypes to robotics production. The core of it is what I call this shift in the world from an old game of prototypes to new game production.
That's amazing. I've tried to do it for my own company to play back the components of the narrative. So did it start with what you call naming the old game?
Yeah. So I sometimes call it name the old game, or sometimes I call it naming the enemy.
Oh, naming the enemy. Say more about that.
I think every great narrative has an enemy, right? Like, Star Wars has an enemy, but what's the enemy in Star Wars, right? Like, let's talk about the first movie, A New Hope. On the face of it, it's Darth Vader. But I actually don't think that Darth Vader is the real enemy. The real enemy in Star Wars for Luke, it's a mindset. It's the mindset that, you win by being all powerful and selfish. And, yes, Vader embodies that mindset, of course, but Luke is battling that in himself too, right? He starts out as this kind of, he's a teenager. He wants adventure. He wants to have, kind of wants the thrill of it. That mindset is the enemy that he has to defeat. And it's, Obi-Wan helps him get over that and, become a more selfless person who, cares about other people. And so in the similar way, when I say name the enemy, sometimes people say, oh, the enemy is some problem that the buyer has. So for instance, in the example I just gave you, you might say, oh, the enemy is, the ability to monitor these machines out in the field. But I actually don't see it that way. I think the enemy is this old mindset of, hey, we just have to succeed in prototyping. And, that's kind of the way we're working. We're going to have to shift it. So yes, you asked, the first thing I do is identify what's that old mindset that the buyer is kind of clinging to. Maybe they don't even realize it or haven't articulated it, but can we articulate it in a nutshell real fast?
I love how you labeled it as a mindset, because it's not always a physical enemy. It can also just be something that's in your head that you may not even know is there, that's forcing you to continue down whatever old habits you have. And then in the second component to it, it sounds like you have to name the stakes to hook them. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, that first part is we want to name the enemy, but then also what's the new mindset that we're championing, that we're saying, hey, the winners are already jumping on this new mindset bandwagon. So with Zuora, it's, shifting from that old enemy of hey, we're just going to sell things, transaction mindset, to hey, we're going to sell things on subscription or services models. With Gong, so I worked with their team early on, and that narrative was all about sales leaders can rely on opinions. That was the old enemy mindset. Now the winners need this view of reality. And yes, getting to the second piece, we want to make sure that this shift we're talking about has life and death stake for the buyers. So it's not just like, oh, here's some shift that's happening for your education. What we want to know is that when we talk about this, they're going to say, oh, yes, this is what's keeping me up at night. That's how we knew with Foxglove, when we started talking about this with the robotics engineers and the C-suite folks, who would say, hey, we're seeing this shift. And they would say, yes, we're seeing this. And then they start opening up about all the challenges that they're facing because of this. For salespeople, this is like discovery gold. We want to hear this. And, likewise, I think for a CFO, who's pitching like an investor, say, who's the first call that investor is going to make for due diligence? They're going to call and say, okay, put me in touch with some of your customers. They're going to call the customer, and they're going to say, well, why did you buy this? Right. And like, what is so important about this? And so by being able to kind of plant that seed first in the investor's mind, like, hey, here's why it's life and death stake urgent for them, the investor can kind of is a little more prepared to go, make that call and say, oh yeah, that's what I'm hearing. Right.
You name the old game, you hook them on what the stakes are, which it seems like is kind of a catalyzing chapter in this because it causes them to open up and realize like, oh shit, I don't want to, be on the other end of this deal. What do you frame up after that?
So we name the old game and the new game. So remember, prototypes, production, we're naming that shift. Sometimes it's just obvious, like it has stakes. Sometimes we'll call it out. What Zuora did was they said, hey, look at the winning companies now. They're all subscription companies. Look at the losers. They're all, they're clinging to that old, we're going to sell you something outright model. Usually after that, I have no template, like no slide deck template, because I just don't believe in that. Like it's always different a little bit. But usually I then go to this thing. The old tools weren't built for this, somehow showing that whatever other things people might think of as alternatives were not built for this new game that we're talking about. Those could be, anything that in the buyer's mind or in the investor's mind, they might say, oh, well, isn't this like X? We're kind of anticipating that. And I do this usually before we even talk about product, before we talk about our thing, because we're really trying to say, hey, there's a kind of our thing sized and shaped hole in the market. Sometimes to do that, the old tools weren't built for this. We'll ask some how will you questions. So like I said with Foxglove, well, how are you going to get the data off all these robots? How are you going to do this and this and this? And then we say the old tools weren't built for this, obviously. And then we've kind of laid out requirements. And now we talk about why ours are, and we're going to answer all those how will you questions, right? And we're going to, show evidence, case studies, whatever you got. This is where, demos and things like that, if that's appropriate.
Hey, thanks for listening. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. Reduce burn, extend runway, do more with less. Operational efficiency. These are all catchphrases that we know all too well because of the headwinds business leaders face in today's growth environment. Growth is now a battle, not a breeze. While teams are on the front lines fighting every day for top-line yardage, there are hidden savings opportunities right beneath their feet. That's where Tropic comes into play. Their procurement platform brings order and process to a historically decentralized and chaotic business function: purchasing and supplier management. Tropic serves as the front door for procurement that your entire company will want to use. By combining intake forms, pricing benchmarks, approval workflows, and supplier management all in one place, Tropic makes savings opportunities easy to find and act on. When you pour blood, sweat, and tears into revenue growth, doesn't it make sense to protect what you have fought for? Visit tropicapp.io/metrics to learn how modern businesses are controlling spend to extend their runway. Your board will thank you. Your budget will thank you. Your bottom line will thank you. Andy, some companies are reluctant to name their competitors by name. What's your take on that? Should you be taking all objections off the table and saying, yeah, I realize that you may compare me to company X, but here's why I'm different?
You're right. Like some companies have different tolerances for this. I don't prescribe either way. I think it can work just as well to say like, we don't have to say like, oh, this company X, Y, and Z, but we could say, hey, this kind of bucket of companies and give them a name. Like in Foxglove's situation, there's a bunch of companies in what's called fleet ops. So of robotics fleet ops. So fleet ops tools sound kind of similar. They're like, oh, I can control a large fleet of robots, but they're really more about the, hey, I want to, direct all my robots to do some activity at a certain time or know what they're all doing. They're not tools for a developer to know, to dig down deep into the data to know like, oh, did this, instead of naming all the different, fleet ops, we'll just say, hey, fleet ops tool, so we're giving them names as kind of buckets of stuff. And then if the person we're talking says, oh, you mean like this company? Yeah. Oh yeah. They're in the fleet op. Other teams have wanted to explicitly name the competitors or the alternatives and specifically call out, why they're not built for this. So I'm kind of agnostic about how they do it.
I've always been of the mind that you're going to get the question from the investor anyway, so you may as well show why you're different. And in my mind, because I do think in slides, for better or worse, I think about the grid where you choose the vectors that you play on. So Airbnb always did that well in their pitch decks when they were going against hotels, where in, a consumer's mind, it's potentially the same thing in terms of options. But if you kind of illustrate it in a way that puts you on different vectors, it can change the perception when someone reads it.
Those vectors are kind of like arrogant doctoring. They're hey, here are these two attributes we picked, and of course we're going to be in the upper right, and everybody else is going to be in the lower left or somewhere around there, right? And it's basically a version of, oh, let me tell you why we're better than all the competitors.
It totally is, and I've been the person who always finds a way to get into the upper right. So guilty as charged there.
We all do, right? We all do. So kind of what the old tools weren't built for this is kind of going to an extreme in that. It's not saying, hey, we're better than them on these certain vectors. It's saying literally they are not built to play in this space, to help you join the movement that we're talking about.
And that sets you truly apart by saying that this is a completely different ball game that we're playing here. So yes, I acknowledge that this may have been the old way of doing things, but we're talking about something fundamentally different.
Yes. And I think we can even do that with something that feels like it would be a close competitor. Is there a way that we can define our kind of view on the world, our approach, such that what might seem like a close competitor is actually not in the same ballpark?
I love that. And so what other elements of this strategic narrative did we not hit on there?
So there's one piece I used to call it naming the promised land. I changed it because people kind of interpret that in a lot of different ways. I use this phrase mindset. Sometimes I talk about it as a game. So what was the old game? What's the new game? So the old game for robotics companies was prototypes. The new game is production. And then I'll say, what's the object of that new game? What's the object as a way to, without having to tell a whole long story about the shift in the world and everything, just is there some way to phrase it down so that we're giving the buyer, I'll sometimes call it the buyer mission statement. You mentioned Airbnb, and Airbnb for a while had these just two words at the top of their website. It said, live anywhere. And I think if you think about that, that really is the buyer mission statement for Airbnb, right? In a way, it's a kind of asymptotically unachievable. Like, we're not literally going to live there, but we're going to try and get you as close as you can to living there through, staying in a real place. And they have this experiences offering where you can do activities locally. With every team, I'm also looking to articulate that. So with Foxglove, the buyer mission statement became understand how your robots sense, think, and act. That's that sense, think, and act is actually a robotics industry phrase. Ultimately, we want to understand how each of these things is doing that thing. That's kind of the goal state for their buyer that they're putting out there.
Maybe a stupid question, but do you have to articulate why what you're doing is hard or why there are obstacles along the way? Or is this good enough that we've kind of shown you the promised land? You don't need to know how the sausage is made.
That's the how will you questions. That's exactly what the how will you questions are about. We said, hey, all the winners are, now building toward production and, going to scale in production, or all the winning sales leaders are acting on a view of reality. Well, if that's an easy thing to achieve, you don't need us to help you. So there's got to be hard things. And that's where as a sales leader, how are you going to know what's being said in all the sales calls that's happening? How are you going to, take those insights and turn them into some kind of program for your team so that, you can feed them back into doing better? I don't know, all these questions, right? And you can imagine in that case, Gong is going to then talk about product features that address all those things.
How I originally found you is I was working on our Series C deck, and I was trying to tell a story that was less problem solution, less arrogant doctor. And so my company, Partstech, is changing how auto mechanic shops order their parts for whatever job you need to be done, whether it's your brake pads or exhaust. And so I'll give you my 30-second overview of how I did it, Andy, and you can pick it apart. So first, I named the old game / the enemy. So people used to order parts over the phone, and the phone is the enemy in that sense. Then I said the new way here is, hey, you can order online. So you don't have to pick up the phone and call Jim at AutoZone anymore for your parts and try to read this really complicated VIN number to him over the phone. The next thing I said is, let me name the stakes to make this more real for you. So you can't always get what you want when you need it. And there are a lot of returns that happen with parts that are really expensive to send back. So the fitment information for one car isn't going to be the same as the other. And if you try to order it over the phone, either they may not have the part, they may not get it to you in time, and you have a car that's stuck on the bay that costs $150 an hour. And maybe they do send it to you, but it's the wrong one. You got to send it back. So it's pretty expensive if you mess this up. And then I said the objective here is to give you an omni-channel procurement experience where you can order from all your suppliers. So you can go into a portal, you can type in a VIN number or a year, make, and model, and you can see AutoZone has these parts, they can get it to you in 45 minutes. Napa has these parts, they can get it to you in 25 minutes. Advanced Auto has these parts, and they can get it to you in 30. So it's kind of like the kayak.com experience. And I said, but how are we going to do that? The data is dispersed, it's wide ranging, and it's really hard to nail down. There are new cars coming to the market every year. And so to overcome that obstacle, what we've done is we've built a data catalog that no one else has. It's our secret sauce that has all the part fitment information for every car in the world. So that's how I did my deck in a TLDR summary.
Who cares what I say? I'll talk about it, but how did it go? How is it played?
It worked because I think you had to get people over this mindset shift of this is how it's always been done. Auto sales are, called 6% of America's GDP every year, and they're totally fine ordering stuff over the phone, so it can't be that broken. And we had to show them how expensive it was and give them examples that, listen, not even, shoe sales from Zappos have a 20% return rate. So we had to break through that mindset shift. And I never thought that I was breaking through a mindset shift. I thought it was a more tangible thing like phone versus online, but that's what it comes down to, how people have historically done things.
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard for me to give advice without a lot of context that I get from actually working with folks. But yeah, I mean, it sounds like you got a lot of the elements there. One of the things I wondered about is when you say phone to online, there's already I'm sure even before your company comes around, there's a lot of online offerings, I'm sure, that maybe they had heard about or whatever. Am I right about that?
Yeah. And so what we said is most of them only offer a single channel experience where you can order from just O'Reilly Auto Parts. What if you could see all your suppliers in real time?
Right. One thing I feel like one way to talk about this would be like, hey, and I'm not saying it's better because what you did worked. So I'll just give you one idea and we can talk about it. Is, hey, this online buying revolution has just transformed every industry. But we're left behind. But auto mechanics have been left behind. We're either ordering from the phone, or if there is something online, it's like whatever you said was wrong with it. It's like a single vendor or single distributor or something like that. I'm sure they've heard this sort of hey, we should be going online, thing before. But so acknowledging also, I think up front, like, hey, why hasn't this happened for us? Might also give you some juice. So we asked a simple question. Sometimes I like to give that buyer mission as a question. And you you had one that it was tell me it was the omni-channel thing. What did you say?
An omni-channel procurement experience for all your auto part needs.
How about, can we get the word omni-channel out of it? Because it's like a complex kind of fancy word. Could you make it a little plainer language? Like,
we were playing around with the idea of one search to rule them all, but it was too Lord of the Ringsy.
It might not be perfect, but let's say, like find anything you need in a single search and have it in 24 hours or less. I don't know, something like that. Get any part in 24 hours or less that you ever need. Maybe just get it to that, right? And so sometimes I like to ask it as a question. So, hey, we said, hey, there's this movement to online, but we've been left behind in our space. And then I like to ask questions. So we asked a simple question. What would it take for auto mechanics to, get any part they needed in 24 hours, and be sure it was the right one and all that stuff, right? or maybe it's like 45 minutes or whatever it is, right? And then we say, well, we'd have to solve these problems. How would you this? How would you have access to like every single distributor? How would you, all this stuff, right? Well, the old tools weren't built for this, You actually might not need the old tools weren't built for this because already you've kind of said, hey, it's not, hasn't happened. And you say, hey, and that's what we built.
I like the question aspect to it because it says, what would nirvana look like? And then you show them the path that took to get there. So I'm going to start using the question rather than the statement. So I use this framework. I'm going to use it again. But my question is, how often do we as a company, so not just me, but we as a company, how often should we be updating this strategic narrative?
That's such a depends question. You use it and then, in some cases it's going to be, the market changes, the world changes in some way that we might have to update it in a year. I'd say more commonly, I see it kind of have legs for a few years, sometimes much longer. Eventually, though, yeah, like if it's really successful, others are going to start seeing a similar story, and they're gonna start parroting you. I mean, there's nothing you can say that's not going to happen. And so I think the people who are really good at this start evolving it when they kind of sense this is starting to happen. I mean, there's a knee-jerk reaction to go back to arrogant doctoring. Like, oh yeah, they're saying the same thing, but here's the 3 features we have that are better than that, right? And the salespeople are going to come to you if you have a sales team, like, hey, we need those points of why we're better than them. One model I think is really great for looking at this is Benioff. Benioff really, to me, is the one when he launches Salesforce, is the first one to come out with this really great strategic narrative. He says, hey, that old mindset called software, own and operate the code on your own machines, that's now a road to ruin. That's the enemy. And the new mindset, the movement we're championing, is the cloud. And he tells that story for like 15 years, something like that. But eventually it starts around 2015. So he launched Salesforce in 2000. Yeah? And eventually, though, it is around 2015, the cloud becomes very ubiquitous. Now, instead of you want to start a website or a web company, you're not going to buy your own machines. This is where around 2015, now you're going to just go to a hosting company and you're going to spin them up in the cloud. And then he starts telling a different story. It's like a bigger story. For a few years, it's like he calls it the connected enterprise. So we used to have things were disconnected and silos. Now everything's connected. And he told that story for a few years. Then, and by the way, every year at Dreamforce, he tells the story. And usually it's the same for a few years, and then it's a new one. Now I followed every year. For a while it was that, then it was the trusted enterprise. It was all about trust. This was especially during pandemic and then just recently in the latest Dreamforce, he's telling a story. He's like, now everyone can be an Einstein. I mean, that's using their product name for their AI solution, but that's a story about, hey, AI used to be this kind of, I don't know, ivory tower kind of thing or senior level or techie thing. And now everybody in every department is going to get to be a genius. This is a different kind of narrative. This is a new narrative, right? And what's interesting is people at Salesforce tell me he actually insists on everyone at Salesforce. So not only sales and marketing people, but finance people, product people, engineers get certified on presenting this deck, this narrative. I think for the reasons we've talked about, and I think that's kind of the shining example I have in terms of how to think about evolving it, how to evolve it, all that you're asking about.
And that's a good tee up. So how should the CFO specifically then get involved in the strategic narrative? Because like you mentioned, it's a company-wide thing, and it sounds like it starts with the CEO, but how should the CFO kind of play into that?
You said it starts with the CEO. That's my approach. And, I started doing this work probably around 10 years ago. And after a few years, I kind of looked at it because I didn't insist that the CEO lead it. Often it would be a marketing person or some other person. a founder who wasn't the CEO. And I look back, like, which were the projects I did where it was like really the most effective and like they could see the results in it. It was always where the CEO was like the person who reached out to me, who led the work directly. And so I began to insist on that. Not everyone, that's a controversial approach in some places. Some places, it's the CEO will delegate it. Even when the CEO leads it, it can't just be the CEO, right? Because it can't just be the CEO dictating. It has to have some buy-in from the senior leadership team. And to me, this is when I get involved in engagement, like this is really the work. One CEO I work with said, I read your posts about the structure of how to do it. I thought it was great. So I actually built a deck. I thought it was pretty good. I showed it to my CFO. He thought it was pretty good. He said, just make a couple of these little changes. I brought it to my head of sales. She said, yeah, pretty good. But those changes that he asked for, change those back and make these changes instead. So, and he said, this became like a year and a half of hell of trying to align. And so that alignment, I think, is the biggest piece. And so when I work with CEOs, I ask them to create a small team that has leaders of sales, marketing, product. And very often there's a CFO in that group. Sometimes it's the CFO, sometimes it's, a co-founder who kind of leads finance or whatever. The role that person plays, usually I have a session where I kind of ask everybody for I lay out the structure like you and I did. And I say, okay, well, what are the pieces for you, for your buyer? What is that old game and new game? You can imagine we get like all these millions and millions of notes and ideas. So then CEO and I go create a draft. And then I have the CEO present that to this small team that often includes the CFO. I always tell the team this first presentation of that draft is going to be the low point of our work together. And you can imagine the team has all these millions of genuinely great ideas, but to get to something clean and powerful, the CEO is going to have to get rid of pretty much all of them to maybe save just a few to build something around. And the CFO can then the good news, this is where that team, the leadership team, gets to weigh in on, and the CFO is going to have a really important perspective, which is often, well, yeah, this thing we're talking about, like, oh, everybody's talking about that, in the finance community, and it's just not very differentiated. We got to come up with something else. Or no, oh wow, yeah, this is something that's, I hear on a lot of people's minds, all that stuff too. I see them as bringing a really important perspective to it, and it's really not uncommon at all that the CFO is part of that very small team.
And I want to stress to the CFOs out there that this is something that I don't look at as homework. I look at it as a huge asset for me to tell the story to investors, to potential partners out there. And it's helped keep me on the straight and narrow just from a consistency standpoint of how I talk about the value that our company provides. So if you can get involved in this, it's a game-changing way to talk about what your company does. Andy, maybe gearing towards a close here. So I've found a lot of value in this. I'm sure others will too. We got some CFOs listen to the podcast with some budget. Maybe they can carve some out. But where can people find you if they would like help with their strategic narrative?
Well, LinkedIn is a good place to connect with me. I also have a podcast where I talk with CEOs about our work together. That podcast is called The Bigger Narrative, and you can find it on whatever podcast platform you want. The CEOs, what we're talking about is the work. And in the work, there is this big question, like, what are we going to build? Like, literally, what is the thing where are we going to write this story down? And in what form? And the traditional answer to that is we're going to put it in a place the world never sees, some kind of internal messaging document, or marketers call like a messaging house or something. And I found, the idea of that is everybody's going to come back to this internal thing and like grab messages from it when they want it. The CFO is going to come to that thing and pull the fragment messages and use those when talking to investors, whatever. And I found that wouldn't happen. Like, people wouldn't actually come back to that thing. And even when they did, it was kind of hard for them to take those messages and string them together in something compelling. So I thought really hard, like, what would work better? And I came to the sales deck as like the core narrative asset. And, you talked about consistency. we're looking, like you said, to have consistency between what is sales and marketing and product and CF and finance saying. And I found like the sales deck is like, if we could all align on that, great. So what you hear in this podcast is the CEO talking about building the sales deck and building it with these higher level, executives. That's a controversial approach. Often the sales deck is seen as some, output of some more fundamental, marketing document or something, or strategic document. But you can hear folks in this podcast talk about like why that approach has worked for them.
I love it. That's great stuff. I'm going to tune in as well to keep refining my story. Andy, thank you so much for being generous with your time and stopping by. Great
talking with you, CJ, and glad to hear the pitch worked for you.
Roll the credits, producer Natalie. Run the Numbers is part of the Turpentine podcast network. It is produced by Natalie Torin and edited by Justin Golden. Album artwork by Some AI Thing. Yelling and intro by Fat Joe. If you made it this far, please give us 5 stars. I really need this.